Hi, everyone. In today's video, I want to talk about the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci's theory of intellectuals. This is found in his prison notebooks, which were a series of reflections on Italian society, politics, and philosophy that he wrote while he was in prison. He was in prison in 1926, and he wrote these notebooks while in prison in between 1929 and 1935. And Gramsci begins the notebooks by thinking about the role of the intellectual. And this might seem like a bizarre place to begin, but it has to do with Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, the notion that a lot of class domination happens at the level of culture. And that therefore, one of the tasks of Marxism is to produce the right kind of intellectual that is going to be able to intervene at the level of cultural hegemony or again at the level of culture. I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in a few minutes, but I want to begin by thinking through the argument that we find in the chapter on intellectuals. Now, Gramsci begins by distinguishing between two kinds of intellectuals. He calls them the traditional intellectuals and the organic intellectuals. Now, traditional intellectuals are people who devote themselves to the life of the mind and who pursue a profession that is historically associated with the life of the mind. In other words, a profession that is already socially coded as being productive in a kind of cognitive way. So think about academics. So I would be a traditional intellectual by Gramsci's account. Think about novelists, literary authors, poets, scientists as well. He also gives the example of the clergy, priests who devote themselves to the study of scripture and for whom there is already, and there has been for a very long time, a kind of career, a profession, a vocation that enables the pursuit of that activity. Now, one of the defining features of traditional intellectuals on Gramsci's account is that I'll say we, since I am included in this, we tend to think of ourselves as if we were autonomous agents in the social field and we were completely independent of the class from which we individually were born or out of which we came. And so let's take the example of a physicist, again, a traditional intellectual, somebody who is a researcher and devotes themselves to the study of some particular slice of the world and has developed expertise in it. If we ask the question, what are the class politics of a physicist? In some ways, it almost seems as if the question doesn't really make sense because a physicist is a physicist, and it doesn't matter if they were rich or poor growing up. It doesn't matter what social class they came from. They now devote themselves to, again, the life of the mind, which has this um, almost sense of classlessness. Or at least it gives off the appearance of classlessness. It exudes a kind of independence and autonomy from the social realm. Again, Gramsci is going to argue that that's not quite the case because intellectuals always perform a certain cultural function. But nonetheless, this is how traditional intellectuals think about themselves. So we have the traditional intellectuals, and then we have what Gramsci calls organic intellectuals. And the term organic is actually a little bit confusing because when I think of organic, I think of something that grows out of the soil and that has a very close connection to the ground. And so when I think of outside of the context of Gramsci's prison notebooks of an organic thinker, I almost think of, like an educator or an activist or a community leader, somebody who has their finger on the pulse of the community that they belong to. So it almost gives you the image of a bottom up approach. But that is not what Gramsci means by an organic intellectual. By an organic intellectual, Gramsci simply means an intellectual who comes to represent and advance the interests of the class from which they emerge. And so the upper class, for example, will produce a lot of intellectuals that then advance the interest of the dominant class. So he gives the example of capitalist intellectuals. Think about entrepreneurs, think about investors, think about leaders in political economy, leaders of industry. All these are people who, in their interpretation of the world and in their activity, are intellectuals insofar as they perform a kind of leadership role in society, but they're not intellectuals in the traditional sense. They're not academics, they're not the clergy, they're not scientists. Rather, they are organic intellectuals in the sense that they come from the dominant class and then they perform activities that entrench or further the interests of that class. In other words, they devote themselves to making money and to making sure that the dominant class continues to make money. Now, in his writings on intellectuals, Gramsci makes it very clear that even if not all entrepreneurs or all businessmen are intellectuals in this kind of expanded sense, there is a lot who will be, or at least the elite entrepreneurs, the ones that show leadership skills and who sort of become movers and shakers relative to their industry. Those are the ones that we refer to as organic intellectuals. And he uses the Italian term dirigente, which means leader or executive, to talk about these organic intellectuals. So even though I myself find the term organic a little bit confusing because it almost suggests somebody working on the ground, it's actually the opposite. Here we're talking about people from the higher class who come from the higher class who enter into an activity that requires some kind of intellectual work, who exhibit leadership potential in that activity, and who in effect become leaders of that activity, thereby enhancing and defending the interests of the very class that engendered them. Now, when Gramsci talks about intellectuals, he argues that what both traditional and organic intellectuals share in common, and that which makes them intellectuals, is that they have two attributes or two skills, maybe we could say. The first one is that they are specialized, meaning that every intellectual, independently of who you have to have some kind of expertise in some specific aspect of the world. If you're a biologist, you specialize in the study of a particular plant or animal. If you're a poet, in a particular kind of poetry. If you're a member of the clergy, you specialize in the interpretation of the Bible, so on and so forth. The same is true of organic intellectuals. You will have some expertise in a particular industry, or in a particular kind of business, or in a particular type of investment. So you need to be specialized. Secondarily, you have to have a kind of political orientation. And again, that's what he means by the term dirigente. You have to exhibit leadership potential in terms of being a mover and shaker of the field in which you are an expert, or even more broadly. So you have to have the ability to get people to either change their beliefs or to change their behavior in some way. So that combination of specialization and a political orientation is what allows us to think of an intellectual as an intellectual. Now, when Gramsci uses the term intellectual, I think it's very important to underscore that he means a social function rather than a self attributed identity, or rather a sense that I personally understand myself as committed to the life of the mind. And the reason why he puts kind of that internal psychological point of view to the side to focus more on the social function of the intellectual is because Gramsci was insistent in his writings um, that every individual technically is an intellectual, right? We all can think, we all have a certain conception of the world, and we all develop a conception of the world through our own physical activity and physical labor independently of what we do. So whether you are the president of the republic, or whether you are a lawyer, or whether you are a construction worker, you will have a certain worldview. And to that extent, you are engaged in intellectual activity. in intellectual work. And so all individuals, he says, are intellectuals in that technical sense, or rather in that basic sense, but not every individual has this social function of the intellectual, which is either having a particular profession, like the traditional intellectuals, or occupying a certain role in relation to your class, whereby you are enhancing the interest of that class by leading a particular industry, for example. And so he wants to focus on that functional understanding, social understanding of the intellectual, which is the role that they play in the social field, in the field of material relations and cultural production. Now, why are we focusing on the function of the intellectual? Or rather, if we're going to say that the intellectual is a social function, what exactly is the function of the intellectual? And this is where we have to make a little detour through Marx in order to understand why Gramsci is so focused on the figure of the intellectual to such an extent that he essentially begins thinking about Italian culture, Italian society by thinking about this figure. Put very simply, intellectuals perform the function of allowing the dominant class to continue to dominate the lower class, especially at the level of culture. At least this is Gramsci's insight in the prison notebooks. Now, the reason that I say that we need to make a detour through Marx is because we need to think about the relationship between what Karl Marx calls the material base of society and the superstructure. Now, without going into great detail about this, for Marx, the material base of society refers to forces of production, to materials, resources, and the production of goods through labor. So here, you just think about the material productive relations of a particular society. And that's the material base. Now, hovering, you can almost have an image of something floating above the material base, and that's the superstructure. And the superstructure essentially includes everything else, every other aspect of society that is not part of the base, and especially those aspects of human life and human culture that in some way justify and legitimate the material base and the class differentiation and class antagonism that grows out of that base or that base produces. And so the superstructure would include things like art, philosophy, religion, politics, law, science, all those aspects that we, very broadly speaking, could just classify as culture or um, intellectual production, the realm of ideas. And the reason that this is a superstructure, again, is because it sort of emerges from the material base, but eventually it sort of turns back down in order to render the material base invisible and immune to critique. So the superstructure refers to all those myths, artistic myths, political myths, scientific myths, legal myths that we tell ourselves and that justify the current organization of society at the level of the material base. So again, with Marx, you have the base and the superstructure. Now, Gramsci, and this is going to be connected to his discussion of intellectuals, and in fact, this is foundational for thinking about that. Gramsci says we actually have to differentiate between the material base and the superstructure, like Marx says. But within the superstructure, we have to differentiate between two superstructural levels. And so the superstructure is not just homogeneous unity. There are these two dimensions to it. On the one hand, you have what he calls civil society, and that's just the way in which individuals interact with one another in the public space and in private space as private citizens. You know, how we interact with one another as consumers, as friends, as lovers, so on and so forth. And so civil society just refers to everything that I do outside of my capacity as a producer outside of the material base, and that has to do with social relations. On the other hand, in the level of the superstructure, you also have this other dimension, which is the state. And those are relations of governance or politics, where you suddenly have some individuals that play the function or that fulfill the function of determining the distribution of rights and duties, so on and so forth. And so you have at the superstructural level, civil society and the state. Now, the connection to intellectuals here. According to Gramsci, intellectuals, and that includes traditional and organic intellectuals, they're all deputies of the dominant class who effectively make these two levels of the superstructure run smoothly. So, for example, think about civil society. Civil society is the kind of social life that that we do when we do everything as private individuals. The books that I like to read, the museums I like to go to. And of course, in that life is implicated art, science, politics, religion. And so all the traditional intellectuals, like the poets, the novelists, the philosophers, the clergy, who construct the world of civil society, the religious world, the social world, the artistic world, they all tell certain narratives that ultimately justify the material base of society. And so the traditional intellectuals who think that they are completely unaffected by class are actually performing a very important class function, and that is maintaining the superstructure that in turn supports and legitimates the material base of society and the capitalist mode of production. Now, think about the state. There are also intellectuals of the state. You think about administrators, politicians, leaders, party representatives. There's a lot of discussion about the party also in the prison notebooks. But again, we have intellectuals who perform a superstructural maintenance level. They maintain the state in its current organization, and part of the function of the state is to ensure that forces of production in their current configuration go unchallenged. And so, all intellectuals, according to Gramsci, for the most part, at least in society as it exists right now, are the deputies of the dominant class. They all ultimately defend the dominant class and protect its ongoing domination of the lower classes. Now, I want to conclude here by talking about one final distinction that Gramsci makes in the section of the prison notebooks devoted to intellectuals. And that is the distinction between rural intellectuals and urban intellectuals. And the important point to make here is that urban intellectuals, those who grew up in a city, who come from urban settings, in general, they tend to be of the organic type because they tend to be tied to industry, because industries usually are concentrated in cities. So if you have like a smart kid in a city, chances are that that kid is going to become an industrialist. And remember, he's writing in the 1920s and 30s. Whereas in the rural setting, most kids who somehow become intellectuals, they actually end up being traditional intellectuals. Most typically priests, because that's really the only avenue of kind of like intellectual upward mobility that is available to kids from rural environments. And that means, according to Gramsci, that the peasantry has no organic intellectuals of its own. Remember, organic intellectual just means an intellectual who comes from a particular class and then represents the interest of that class. We know that the upper class has its own organic intellectuals, the entrepreneurs, the investors, the business leaders, the industry leaders. But the peasantry doesn't have any organic intellectuals of its own because whatever intellectuals it produces become typically traditional intellectuals. And those traditional intellectuals, even though they don't think that they are supporting the status quo, ultimately do, precisely by maintaining that level of the superstructure as it exists right now, especially in connection to civil society. Now, the really pessimistic conclusion to all of this is that the peasantry basically has no intellectual representatives of its own, or at least no intellectuals that come to the defense of its interests. And so you have the dominant class that produces its own organic intellectuals that defend it, and that has the traditional intellectuals to defend it in a more indirect way. And then you have the peasantry that is not defended by the traditional intellectuals and that doesn't have organic intellectuals. So the peasantry is constantly hemorrhaging. It's just constantly hemorrhaging intellectual potential, intellectual power, such that its intellectual capabilities are constantly being appropriated by the upper class. And this is where you see why Gramsci is so interested in thinking about intellectuals in the context of class antagonism, because he believes that one of the most important ways in which class domination happens is at that superstructural level, which is the level of intellectual life. All the intellectuals, in short, end up supporting the dominant class.